When we're young, we have an amazing, positive outlook about how great life is going to be, but somewhere along the line, we forget to dream and end up settling. Join Up Dots features amazing people who refuse to give up and chose to go after their dreams. This is your blueprint for greatness. So here's your host, live from the back of his garden in the UK, David Ralph.
Yes, hello there. Good morning to you. How are you? How are you? How are you? The sun is shining. It's glorious. It's the 22nd of July. Summer's gone. The World Cup's gone. We won't talk about that if you're an Englishman. Wimbledon, well, no, we're not going to talk about any of that kind of stuff. We're only going to talk about positive forces in our life. And today we have got a man who he's a fascinating character. He really is. Because he's got a fascination for unusual facts and I guess characters and communities across the world. From a young child, he always had an interest for the obscure. And as we found time and time again on Join Up Dots, he's now taken this childhood interest and created a career around it by travelling around the world to cultivate his curiosity of the obscure. An expert in what he calls small worlds, such as the extreme metal scene and the British Jewish community, he loves to research and participate in these communities, and after graduating as a sociologist at university, found himself drawn again and again to these small worlds. But what became clear is that there are huge commonalities within these small groups, and he developed this interest by investigating the Luxembourg waterski scene, interviewing the most powerful politician in Alderney, and even jumped across the water to meet the Icelandic special forces known as the Viking squad. Honestly, I'm not making that up. So what got him going in this direction, and how has he managed to create a life that is both hugely fascinating but anything but usual? Well, let's find out as we bring onto the show to start joining up dots the one and only Mr. Keith Kahn Harris. How are you today, Keith?
I'm great. Thanks for the very effusive introduction.
I know it's not usual for an Englishman to be like that, is it? I've kind
Absolutely not.
We like to go low key in England. It's the way we do it. But I can't hold back my excitement when I press record. It's like a different me that comes out.
Fair enough.
So you have got a fascinating tale, sir. But before we start on all this sort of fascinating stuff, it is quite freaky, isn't it? It's quite weird the scenes that you have delved into and have become experts in, and it's that kind of, and I quote, I'm doing little rabbit sort of quotey things here, it's that freakiness that really appealed to me. I love it. I really do love it. So can you go right back in time, and when you was a small child, were you the kind of kid that always used to get the Guinness Book of Records facts for Christmas and all those kind of 110 things that you never knew you didn't know kind of books?
Well, actually, as it happens, I do remember, it's a very strong memory in my childhood, reading the Guinness Book of Records over and over again, usually over at the breakfast table. So yes, I was exactly that kind of kid. I mean, today it's changed completely, because now when I'm curious about anything, then I just look on Wikipedia, which is fantastic. One of the things I love about the contemporary web is that as soon as you're curious about something, you can satisfy that curiosity immediately. Although that leads to some problems as well. I mean, the instant gratification isn't always good. But yes, I was that child.
It's true about instant gratification, because I was saying to one of my colleagues the other day that I remember when I'm younger, I'm 44 years old. I'm not old by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly compared to the last, say, 10, 15 years, I remember sort of going in looking for records, for example. And if anybody doesn't know what a record is, it's a big black thing with a hole in the middle that you used to sort of play music on. It was like an early runner to CDs and stuff. And I used to hunt for these records, and I used to go into shops and thumb through and try to find it. And when you did find it, it was the greatest feeling in the world. But as you say, with instant gratification, you go onto Amazon, you put in a couple of words, and you just find it. And it's that search of the kind of unusual, the difficult to get, which it's not as good as it used to be, even though it's so much easier, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's also misleading, because sometimes that you can find out the basics about something, but finding out anything more still takes work. That's certainly the case with some of the things that I've investigated, where there's a smattering of information online, but you really have to dig deeper if you want to find out more about it. But yes, I mean, we have lost something clearly in the instant availability, but we've also gained as well, and that's pretty much the nature of social progress anyway, that it's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Well, what for you have we lost from the internet? Obviously, we have gained more than we've lost. But are there any things that you kind of go, oh, in the good old days, when I was a child and I had to do my homework, if you were like me and you had to go down to the library and look open a book and all that kind of stuff, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But are there any things that you kind of think, yeah, it used to be better before we had this portal to the world?
Well, I actually, earlier this year, I published a series of articles on the web, ironically enough, on precisely that issue, but applied to the global metal scene, which I've done a lot of writing about and research on over the years. And I've said that, yes, in many ways it's heaven. As soon as you're interested in a particular sound, you can go and investigate it, and it was much more difficult to do that in the past, in part because certainly with extreme metal, everything was so underground that it was extremely difficult to get. But we've lost a lot with that as well. I mean, we've lost this sort of sense of scenes lack shape anymore because everything moves so fast, everything is so instantly available that there aren't the same sense of structure. Everything seems to be exploding in every different direction at once. Everything seems to be happening at once, and that's quite a bewildering world. And it also lacks that sense of I'm not sure how you describe it. It lacks that sense of reward for investigation, which has always been one of the most rewarding things about life generally. That the knowledge has often been in the past very hard won. It still is to a certain extent, of course, in some fields. But when knowledge isn't hard won, it flattens out cultures really to an extent, and that's a shame, really.
So when you were investigating, if we went back to your first one, which was it the British Jewish community or the extreme metal scene? What was the first small world that you got involved in?
It's the extreme metal scene, although it's not quite as small as it once was. That was actually my PhD thesis, which I completed. I did that between 1996 and 2001, based on case studies on extreme metal in Israel, Sweden, and the UK, although the Israeli scene was pretty small then and is still quite small today. So, yes, that was the first one I looked at.
And for all our listeners, and I'll be honest, a bit me, what is extreme metal?
Extreme metal is metal pushed to its limits. It's things like death metal and black metal and doom metal, often very fast, often quite impenetrable, uncompromising, dealing with transgressive, often disturbing themes, that kind of thing.
So is it just a terrible noise? Is it one of these places where it's just like screaming, shouting, guitar, or has it got a good tune? I feel stupid even saying that fact.
Tunes are often overrated. I mean, some of it has more tunes than others, but I think extreme metal generally sounds, to people who aren't familiar with it, it does sound like a noise. But when you get to know it, you can appreciate it's often technically very sophisticated, although you have to listen carefully to hear that. And it has a complexity and a subtlety even that might surprise people, but you do have to put in the hours to actually find that out.
And so how do you do that? How do you get yourself to be submerged in a scene like that? Do they accept you instantly, or is there a kind of reluctance to let sort of outsiders? Because I suppose in certain ways you was a journalist. I know it was your PhD, but you were going in there to sort of investigate.
Well, I was both an insider and an outsider, because I'd always had a fondness for extreme metal. I was never very involved in the extreme metal scene as such, and I listened to lots of other music. So really investigating it involved me just pushing myself a few steps further along the continuum of involvement. And one thing that helped is that I started writing for an extreme metal magazine called Terrorizer, which gave me a certain status within the scene as well. So actually, it really wasn't difficult. The only difficult thing was that I was doing this when the internet wasn't quite as developed as it was today. So often getting hold of people that I wanted to speak to an interview wasn't quite as easy as it would have been had I done the same research today. So it wasn't, and people are actually extremely friendly in that world. You might not think it, but they are. It's quite a nice community, or at least in my experience it is.
So how do you do that? You know, we are so programmed on online connecting. So how did you do that? How did you find these people if you didn't have that ability of LinkedIn and email and all the kind of things that we find ourselves drawn to now?
Well, there was a certain amount of it even then. I mean, people did have email addresses in the late 1990s, although not everyone did. It actually, the process of contacting people was actually very useful, because to contact people, there was no substitute for talking to people. You talk to one person who puts you in touch with another person like that. So in order to contact particular individuals, you've got to become part of the scene. And that was a really useful process for me. It meant that I came to understand how it works.
So real life networking, which is a kind of skill that we are losing somewhat, aren't we? Because it's so easy to jump onto LinkedIn. You know, I connected with you on LinkedIn, or was it LinkedIn or email? I can't remember. But it was, I found you, thought you sounded fascinating, sent out an email, and I didn't get off my chair once to do it.
No, to be honest, I'm not sure I miss the old days in that respect, in the sense that it was often extremely frustrating not being able to get in touch with people. It still is today. I mean, not everybody is an open book, and LinkedIn doesn't often make it easy to contact with strangers, or at least it makes it quite complicated to do it. So it's not quite as simple in every case today. But no, I don't really miss that. I like, so much of my work today involves getting in touch with lots of different people, and I like being able to do that much more easily than in the past. Although real world networking is still really important. I mean, often the reason I'm trying to get hold of people would be to say, can we meet? And I don't think real world networking has at all diminished in importance. In fact, it's probably even more important now than it's ever been.
Do you, I normally ask this at the end, but do you love your work? Because it's a career that you've really cultivated, haven't you, from almost nothing. And is it something that is work, or is it a hobby, or is it just a hybrid of the two?
Well, I would say I do love my work. I've been privileged to carve out a career when I can follow my enthusiasms. But I don't love every single aspect about it. I mean, I think that in every single career, most people have to do at least some aspects of it which are annoying or difficult or whatever. Sometimes they're the more administrative tasks, or sometimes they're just the legwork that you have to do. So yeah, it's not always fun, but ultimately I'm very happy with what I do.
So is it more a hobby than a career, or career than hobby?
I would say that everything in this kind of career, when you spend your life writing and researching and doing the sort of stuff I do, that I don't know what the difference is between hobby and life. There are some interests that I've never pursued in terms of writing and stuff. But a lot of things eventually turn up in something or other that I'm involved in. I don't have anything that I do purely as a kind of civilian, if you like.
The words you just said really sort of resonate with me, because I've been having a lot of conversations recently, and Richard Branson is a big hero of entrepreneurs across the world and successful people, and why not? Because he's uber successful and he seems to love what he's doing. And one of his taglines, or one of his quotes that he said many years ago was, "I don't consider work work and play play, it's just living." And that certainly resonates with me now doing this. But certainly when I was a 9-to-5er, I would never have dreamt that work and play could mix. It was something that very much was kept separate. And so you kind of almost unknowingly buy into that already, don't you?
I do, although, I mean, as I say, I mean, there is a certain amount of drudge work that I have to do. There are sometimes meetings that I don't particularly want to go to. There are sometimes annoying administrative tasks that I have to do. But, you know, that's just life. I mean, I don't see, unless you're incredibly wealthy and incredibly privileged, I don't see how you can expunge that from your life. It's part of what it is to be human, I think.
Well, I think a lot of people do get rid of it now, don't they? With sort of virtual assistants and people from like China and the Philippines doing a lot of their social media work and their online drudgery, as you say. There is a huge lot to doing this show. I love doing this. I love talking to you, and I say this a lot on many of the shows. If I could take away everything and just have the conversations, wow, utopia. But you can't. You have to do a certain amount of other stuff, which is drudgery. But I do think there's a point where you can start outsourcing all the things that you don't like. And for many times, these people are so well trained and they're like Terminators. They will just bash it out for you at a minimal cost.
Yes, that is possible. But actually, the counter argument is that sometimes the sort of more routine tasks are actually quite comforting. I mean, I remember yesterday I was very tired. I had a long to-do list, all of which seemed a bit daunting. But the first thing I did yesterday was enter mine and my family's passport details onto the booking for a holiday we're going to take in August, and that took 10-15 minutes. And actually, it was kind of quite calming in an odd sort of way. Sometimes administrating your life actually gives you a bit of breathing space. Too much of it, though, and it's just a pain.
So where are you going on holiday in August?
It's not that exciting. My wife is actually from Texas, and we're going to Texas to see her family.
So we're talking
which we do.
And we're talking about America and not like the DIY store that we have in this country. No,
not the DIY store. We're talking about Texas, yes.
Now, that's exciting, isn't it? Going to Texas. I'll tell you a fact about Texas. This is a good one, and this is something that you can start investigating. So when you get out there and you're bored, you can just start whizzing around. Do you know there's more tigers in Texas than any other place on Earth?
They're not wild tigers, are they?
No, they're not, but they're captive. But if you take all the tigers on Earth, Texas has more of them. And here's the second whammy, Mr. Keith Harris. So you will cling to this, and this will make you attractive at parties when people start talking about tigers.
I will try it out. I will definitely try it out.
If I was told, if you want to buy a tiger cub, how much do you reckon it costs?
Tell me.
No, that's not how it works. You know, give me a figure, and then I will tell you if you're right or wrong.
No, I think it would be in the thousands. That's about as much as I can say.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? Apparently $500 will buy you a tiger cub. And so in Texas, apparently they've got quite a fascination of having these tiger cubs because they're cute and it's a tiger that I've got. But of course they get big and you've got to sort of get rid of them. But yeah, more tigers in Texas. That is why you got up today, isn't it? And got on the mic so early.
Absolutely. Well, my son, when he was younger, he's 11 now, but when he was younger, he used to be really into horses. And he used to save up his pocket money when he first started having pocket money because he wanted to buy a horse. And I kept telling him that actually it's not expensive to buy a horse. What's expensive is keeping a horse. And I think that's probably the case with tigers as well, I'd imagine.
But a tiger can kill you and a horse can't. Well, I suppose it can. But no. Don't go there. If anyone's out there at the moment and they're saying to their mum and dad, that man on the radio, he's just said I could buy a tiger for $500. They do grow up. Like everything.
They do, indeed.
Yeah, we do grow up. So would that be a small world that would fascinate you, or is that just kind of a mad fact? How do you differentiate between your worlds that appeal and drag you in, like the Viking squad, the Icelandic special forces, which I didn't even know that they had one of those?
I have to burst your bubble there. I didn't get as far as that in the book that I was writing because the crowdfunding ran out. But at least I found out about it.
That was in your TED talk. I watched a whole 20 minutes of you, sir, talking on TED, and it didn't happen. Yeah, TEDx.
No, it did happen. I mean, I was crowdfunding this book, The Best Water Skier in Luxembourg, and I managed to fund 2 chapters, the one on Alderney in the Channel Islands and the one on Luxembourg. And the next one I wanted to go to was Iceland, and it was that point that the money ran out. But, I still had a blast, so, what the hell.
So let's jump back onto that. So how did that come about, the Luxembourg water skiing scene, chapter 1 of this book, that you decided that you were going to crowdfund it, or whatever, to go around the world investigating these small worlds? How did that first fact come up, Luxembourg water skiing scene?
It used to be a joke that I make because over the last few years I've achieved. I mean, it's not boasting really to say that I'm one of the top global academic scholars in the study of heavy metal. Because whilst there are quite a few of us, there are not that many of us compared to some academic fields. So I used to say, yes, well, I'm quite important in that field, but ultimately it's just like being the best water skier in Luxembourg, meaning just a silly way of saying a big fish in a small pond. And the idea just came to me 3 years ago. What about actually finding out about the best water skier in Luxembourg? And that's where the idea came from. The idea would be that I'd know nothing about it, and I'd find out about it. And I approached, there was a new crowdfunding book publishers. It's new then, it's been going a while now, called Unbound. And I had a fairly loose contact with the guy who was running that, John Mitchinson, who somebody else I knew him. So I sent a 1-page proposal, and he loved it, and he signed me up. But it was just part of the problem with the whole thing was that because it involved a lot of traveling, it was a very big ask in terms of crowdfunding, and it stalled after a while. But it's fine. I had a blast, and I did get to meet the best water skier in Luxembourg.
And how good was he? Was he kind of just okay?
Well, there were interesting stories there. Is that I did, I think, prove my point, which is that you can choose small worlds at random, and you will find, if you dig deep enough, you'll find interesting stories. And part of the interesting story was, there are 2 kinds of interesting stories I found out. One was that Luxembourg, surprisingly enough, had both, in the 60s, had a world champion and a European champion in water skiing. And they had this quite small but tight-knit but kind of overachieving Luxembourg water skiing scene. But then there was a horrible schism in the 1970s when it split into 2 rival national water skiing federations. And I met these 2. This guy was the European champion was a guy called Jean Kalmus, and the world champion was called Sylvie Hussermann. And their 2 families fell out over this split. And I tracked down both of them. Today I met them both, and the pain was still there. I mean, which was really interesting. And the other story was that water skiing in Luxembourg, and actually in other places around the world to discover, is kind of losing ground to wakeboarding in the same way that sort of conventional skiing is losing ground to snowboarding. So there's this so there are actually very few serious water skiers in Luxembourg now. But the guy who I anointed the best water skier in Luxembourg, he's now he's in the top 100 in the world in the veterans category, which isn't bad. It's certainly better than I can do in water skiing.
And was he surprised that this Englishman was investigating him? Was it kind of, oh, this is crazy, or was he kind of aware of his status over there in his small world?
To some extent, but I think that it was. I mean, he was somebody who worked very hard for this water skiing scene. I mean, that was what he'd spent his spring, summers, and autumns doing, was teaching, was going over his practicing over and over again, and also teaching young people how to water ski, and running the water skiing club that he belonged to, and it's hard work. You know, people who are dedicated to what they do, it's not always fun, and that's what I mean. So the book dragged you in with a sort of a silly title, but actually is making a serious point about the dedication of people.
It's fascinating for me that there are so many small worlds. I think I'm a weird person. I think I started to think that I'm weird. I love the global concept of it, but I kind of like that within that globe, within the world that we live on, there's so many little areas of life and communities and techniques and whatever you could say that are going on in these small worlds. Now, in the introduction, I said there's commonalities across these communities. Would that be right, or have I just kind of assumed that there must be because these are small groups?
I think there's an almost infinite variety of these things. These small worlds are what people live their lives in, and they're often sort of, you know, people sometimes look down their nose at certainly some kinds of small worlds, but you know, this is the way life is lived. This is what gives comfort and home and security and meaning in what can often be a very alienating sort of world. I'll give you another example. It's my son. Second time I've talked about my son. He's now into Warhammer, tabletop gaming. And because of that...
What is that? Sorry, Warhammer?
Warhammer. It's you know, you have these sort of model figures and you play war games with them.
Oh, what, like soldiers?
Yeah, except it's sort of fantasy rather than soldiers.
Oh,
but
right,
anyway,
okay.
He's very into that. And there's this... I was sort of dimly aware of it before he got into it, but now he's into it. There's this just enormous world of this sort of stuff going on. And it's an incredibly welcoming world. And it's given my son a lot of, an enormous amount of pleasure, but also self-confidence, and which is great, really.
Well, it is, isn't it? And, you know, so many people go with the mass approach to stuff. But I think that actually the warmth and the comradeship does come from going niche, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent these days everybody's a niche. I mean, it's you know, small worlds are less obscure than they once were. They're much more discoverable, and you know, and some niches are bigger than others. In a way, I've always seen it in terms of my personal life is that the way to a happy life really is to find that niche. I mean, it's a fairly banal point, but I think it's important.
Well, why do you think it's banal? Because I don't think that's banal at all.
No, but maybe it's one of these truths that it's so much it's just in front of your nose that we sometimes forget it. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. That's what this show is all based about. It's based about the truths that we can all see, but no one can see it until they smack us in the face. And one of the things, you know, why I jumped straight onto the Guinness Book of Records reference, it has come up time and time and time again that anyone that I have spoken to that become successful and find their passion are just doing in an adult sense what they loved doing as kids. And it's amazing that we go on this path where we go to university, college, get our degrees or whatever, and we go into jobs just because we think it's a career which is rewarding, and then hate it because we're not actually playing to the things that we love doing. And I keep on saying to everyone, look back at what you loved doing as a child. And now there's so many options out there. There's so many avenues that you can travel down, especially in the online world, where a lot of these passions can be created into a career that is like yours. A third love, a third work, and a third drudgery. But that's better than 9 to 5 days of total drudgery, which so many people have.
But yeah, let me also give the counter argument. Is the big downside of making a career out of what you love is that you're never off duty. You're never off. It's constant. It never ends. Certainly that's the case in my life. There's always something new I could be doing or should be doing. It's you never come to the end of anything. You come to the end of particular projects, but not to the end of the bigger project. And sometimes actually, you know, it would be quite nice to just clock off at the end of the day and do something I enjoy.
No, it wouldn't, Keith. You'd hate that. You're laying there on your sofa and you're watching telly and you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'm only watching this because the wife wants me to watch it. I wish I was doing something else. I bet you're like that.
I sometimes like to veg out in front of the TV. I can't deny that. But it's certainly true that I'm probably that I'm drawn to doing something that I'm passionate about. And that I'd probably be quite unhappy if I wasn't doing that.
Absolutely. See, I've turned you around. You like your counter-arguments, Mr. Keith Kahn Harris, but I'm turning you around. And I'm going to play the words of Steve Jobs now. We normally do this around about the sort of half-hour mark because it is a fascinating speech and it is the theme of the whole show. And for somebody like yourself, I think these words are gonna have huge resonance with you. So this is Steve Jobs, and then I want to hear your point of view on these and whether you think they're true or whether you think they're total rubbish. This is Steve Jobs.
Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart even when it leads you off the well-worn path, and that will make all the difference.
Is it simplistic, or can your path go all the way back to the breakfast table and the Guinness Book of Records and all that kind of stuff?
I think it depends on the individual. I think for me, that is the case. I think you can join the dots relatively easily with most aspects of my life, certainly looking backwards. I'm not sure that's the case with everybody, though. Some people's lives sort of pinball between different enthusiasms that can't be knitted up together. And sometimes things fail to cohere. I mean, things have failed to cohere in my own life, that there have been projects that I've taken that have proved to be blind alleys, although sometimes very enjoyable blind alleys. So I think it's sometimes true, but maybe not always true. What is definitely true, though, is that when you look back on your life when you're at a certain age, and I'm 42 now, a lot of things that didn't seem to be clear at the time become clearer in retrospect. And actually, that's why I'm enjoying being middle-aged a lot more than I thought I would, because you know a lot of stuff actually starts to make sense. And
like
you
what, Keith?
yourself.
What kind of things do you look back on now with clarity because you are 42?
Well, I'll give you one example. It took me only until relatively recently. There was one aspect of myself that I didn't understand, certainly as a kid and as a teenager, and even into my 20s, which was that sometimes I wanted to be alone, and sometimes I was very gregarious. And I didn't understand the relationship between those two sides of me, really. They seemed to be so different that they didn't make sense. And then gradually, I recently found the term ambivert that describes people like me, and that there are others who can be gregarious, who like being gregarious and also like being alone. and that it is something that is more common than perhaps I thought at the time, and that's fine, and that is just me, and so now when I want to be alone, I don't sweat it, and when I want to be with other people, I don't sweat it either, because I recognize that I need both things, and that neither of those things cancel the other.
I'm like that totally, though, and I it's always been a weird thing. I've been a trainer, so I'm always getting up and doing training courses, and I have a switch that I can switch mentally, bang, and then I'm the force of the room, and I can do my presentation, my show, whatever, and then withdraw into myself. But when I withdraw into myself, I don't want to talk to anyone. I just want to sort of be in my own little box, doing my own little thing, before I then have to flick that switch and burst out into the world again. And I'm very much like that on the mic. If you hear me on the mic now, yes, this is me. And if you hear me in a social situation, there's no difference. It's pretty much the same. But the bit in the middle, that's my own time. And I now look at that. That's the way that we recharge ourselves, ready for the big stuff. You know, you couldn't go hell for leather all the time, could you? You've got to have those quiet times when you reflect and you sit there and you recharge yourself, and you don't have kids bothering you and the wife bothering you and work bothering you and all that kind of stuff. But when you do then go, right, I'm ready to go, bang, you're on 100% because you've had that time. That's the way I think of it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it may be that actually that most of us are ambiverts, actually. I'm not sure. But certainly it's probably more common than I once thought.
It's a small world, but I think we could do a combined investigation. I think, yeah, because I'd never heard of the word ambivert until then.
There you go.
You are changing me. So where do you get these ideas from? You're creating this life, and it's very much a world of your own creation. Is it the case that you kind of just something pricks your interest? You're sitting watching telly and something is said and you think, oh, I've never heard of that? Or is there a structure to what you're developing so that when you look back on your life work, you could go, yes, I could actually join up the dots and my work is complete?
I think increasingly now that I'm kind of restricted to, just through pressure of time, to my two principal writing and research interests, which is Jews and metal, and sometimes both together. And so there's that, and also the necessity of making a living, kind of, which is more serious and more urgent because I'm older now and have a family to support and all that kind of stuff. It means that I'm a little less free than I once was, and also once you start on this sort of process of becoming expert in certain things, which has taken me a very long time, then it starts to take on a momentum of its own, and projects lead to other projects and stuff like that. So I still have. Having said all of that, I still have a file in Evernote where I keep lists of other books I want to write, other things that I want to do, and that I hope to get around with other points. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And it's, you know, at some point, hopefully, there'll be some new interest from that I can pursue. I can't stop myself thinking. Things just pop into my head all the time. There's a kind of restless energy to what I'm doing, which isn't always helpful. Sometimes it'd be easier just to be a bit more focused, but you know, ideas still come and still excite me. I mean, I'm thinking of trying to get some of these ideas out there, because it's actually getting a little bit frustrating that I have to prioritize work, serious stuff, and sometimes can't do these more whimsical things. The writer and philosopher George Steiner wrote a book a few years ago called My Unwritten Books, which was, he'd written many books in his lifetime. It was a book basically where each chapter described a book that he had once hoped to write, but for various reasons had to abandon the project or never had time or so on. And I'm thinking of writing something similar myself. In fact, maybe we should all do that. Maybe that everybody who feels they've got a book in them, or in my case, several books in them, should get out the books they'll never write, or at least in summary form. I mean, I've written and published 4 books, and I'm very proud of that. But there are another 50 to 100 books that I'd like to write and will never write.
Are they always fiction or non-fiction? Which way do you go?
No, it's not fiction. I mean, I've never written fiction. They're practically all non-fiction, although I've had the odd fiction idea, but I think that is one area I'm not going to go into, because I think if you want to write a fiction book, you've got to be absolutely passionate about it. And I have the occasional twinge of desire to write a fiction book, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. I did have a very good idea for a fiction book, but I couldn't. I could never pull it off. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, go for it.
Do you remember the book Fatherland by Robert Harris?
Yes.
It's a book. It's a thriller based on the premise set in the 1950s, but it's set in Germany. But if the Nazis had won the war, and there's actually it's almost like a subgenre itself. There are plenty of books that take their premise that the Nazis had won the war, and I quite like books like that. I quite like alternative histories and stuff. But I thought of writing a fiction book, written with the premise that the Allies had won the war, but from the perspective of a Nazi in a Germany that had won the war, right? So what would it be like if we were living in a world in which the Nazis had won the war? Would there be people writing dystopian thrillers about what would happen if the Allies had won the war in Germany? And you probably think I'm absolutely nuts now. Now, you'd have to be a brilliant, brilliant writer to pull something like that off. And I don't think I'm a brilliant writer, certainly in terms of fiction. But it's an idea that I quite like.
It's a good idea. It's a good idea.
I think people would actually find it. Some people would find it grossly offensive. Actually, the idea that the Allies winning the war was actually a dystopia.
Well, I read a book by Martin Amis called Time's Arrow.
Time's Arrow, yes.
Yeah.
So there are it's just a sort of different take on it's a different take on the idea of alternative futures and stuff. But that is one book I will never write, although I'd like to write a couple of pages sometime on it, maybe so somebody else could pick up the idea. I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, you've got a huge audience listening here. I bet there's somebody scribbling away thinking, that's it, that's the idea I've been waiting for. And then
if they are, good luck to you, and I look forward to reading it.
that'd take the pressure off you, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah.
You can lay there on the sofa, vegging out, knowing that you've got a few days off because someone somewhere is doing your work. Perfect. That's the life we want. So, with yourself, what are you aiming for now, Keith? So, you are focused on the British Jewish community and the extreme metal scene and all that kind of stuff. And even though I'm talking to you and you're talking with such passion, in my head I kind of think, how is there enough to write on here to build a career? That's where my brain doesn't kind of operate. I think to myself, how can you do this day in, day out on such small worlds?
Well, I mean, the Jewish world is pretty big. I mean, it's 15 million people around the world, 300,000 in the UK, and a lot's happening with it. And there are a lot of different facets with it, and there are not that many people doing that kind of research in Britain. So there's plenty of scope in Britain for doing that. And in terms of metal, it's actually bigger than you think. We're talking about millions of people worldwide, and it's changing all the time. One thing that I've really enjoyed in the last few years, I mean, my book came out in 2007, but since then I've been kind of tracking the changes in the scene. And so, in that respect, you can write about it non-stop because things are always changing.
But what? Just the kind of the style of music or the characters, or how is that kind of changing?
Partly the aesthetics and the music itself, but also the circumstances in which it resides. I mean, we're living in the extreme metal scenes are different today to when I was doing my PhD because of the impact of the internet, and who knows what developments will affect it tomorrow. Ditto in the Jewish world. The Jewish world changes as the rest of the world changes, and it's constantly changing at a very fast pace.
Have you lost any of your hearing going to extreme metal?
I wear earplugs now, and actually so do most people.
Yeah, because I went to a tribute band many years ago. It was a status quo tribute band. And it's not exactly metal, but, you know, the Quo's got their place. And this band was so loud, my ears rang for 3 days afterwards. And now I've lost all the sort of high range of my hearing. I can't hear. So if I'm in a sort of field or abroad and people say, oh, listen to all those crickets, can't hear them at all. It's absolutely blocked out. So were you aware that that kind of noise could cause you problems when you were a young man, or did you just sort of plough into it like I did, thinking it's got to be loud?
I was vaguely aware of it when I started going to gigs in my teens, but I think generally there's more awareness of it now, whether you're a teenager or someone in my age. I mean, you go to gigs, not just metal gigs, other forms of music, and you will see people wearing earplugs. It's also because earplug technology has actually got better. There are earplugs that you can get now that the problem with earplugs has always been that they filter out. They actually, it doesn't just make everything quieter, it also cuts some of the range. But now you can get earplugs that don't do that. If you look at any band on stage these days, not any band, but most bands, they'll be wearing earplugs.
Yeah, I must admit, because when I realised my hearing had dipped a bit, I had to go to this gig, and I was really, oh my God, I can't lose any more of my ears. I've got to protect them. And I realised that when I had the earplugs in, because it kind of dulled the volume, they sounded terrible. And when I sort of took them out, they sounded all right again. And it was that volume that kind of increased the quality somehow, because I couldn't hear the intricacies of the music.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but, you know, you've got to make these sacrifices these days.
You do. And just before we bring you to the end of the show and I put you on the mic, when we send you back to have a one-on-one with your younger self, I want to send you forward. So when you're sort of like 90 and you're laying on your bed, what do you think the world is going to remember of Keith Kahn Harris? What would you like to say, that was my mark?
Well, I'm kind of satisfied with having published books. I've published 4, plus a few edited collections. I would like to publish more, but, you know, even if, you know, I never publish anything else, you know, that's my mark. I think that's the great thing about books. Although you do have to, I mean, one of the sobering facts is that when you do publish a book is that you realise that every year hundreds of thousands of other people are also publishing books. So I'm not making any illusions about my books are still going to be read in 100, 200 years' time. But at the very least, they'll be in a library somewhere, probably a digital library. And it will be there probably for the indefinite future. And for me, that's enough.
I wrote a book once and I've never published it. And it was the process of writing it. One of my colleagues said to me, oh, you're always writing things. Why don't you write a book? And I went, oh, I might do one day. He went, you'll never do it. So I went, okay, I will. And I'm going to start now. And I was lucky. I was in a job up in the city where you could get away with days not doing anything at all. And so I'd sit there writing this book, and it went from 1 page to 20 pages to 40 pages all the way through. And it became such a chore, because what I realised now, if anyone is going to write a book, unless you're a lot better at it than me, which I bet you probably are, just write it. Just write the story. Boom, get it away. I started editing as I was going, and I found then that I had read the book 600 times and it became boring to me, where when somebody picked it up fresh, it was a good story. And I had that same vision that, it would be in the British Museum and my mark would be left, this book. But I've got it on a disc and I've never published it or moved it on.
Well, I think the difficulties about books are not writing them, it's editing them.
It certainly was a case in my I just got sick to death of going over this story, trying to sort of find areas I hadn't quite got right. It just lost its thrill to me. Probably if I started now, I haven't looked at it for 10 years, I'd probably go, this is pretty good. I should get it out there. But maybe one day. So that's your mark. That's your mark on the world, that you've left your books. And that's a great thing to leave, isn't it? Because so many people do come and go on this world, and they don't leave anything behind. I heard only 1% of the world's population ever leaves their mark. 99% just come and go, and nobody remembers them.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean that if you don't... I mean, having kids, of course, is another way of leaving your mark. But to some extent, we all leave our mark because the world is a single system. And you take one person out of it, unless it's a hermit living in a cave, you know, we've all had an impact. I mean, some impacts may be bigger than others, but the world is different for every person having been in it. And, you know, that should be quite comforting, I think. I find it comforting.
Well, let's comfort you together. Let's go with it. I'm going to put you on the mic now. This is a sermon on the mic, and I'm going to play the theme tune. And as it's playing, this is when you will be transported back in time to have a one-on-one with your younger self. And if you did walk into a room and you saw a young Keith, what age Keith would you choose? Would it be the 5-year-old sitting with the Guinness Book of Records? Would it be the university Keith? What kind of advice would you give them? So this is the sermon on the mic.
Here we go with the best bit of the show, the sermon on the mic, the sermon on the mic.
I think the self that I'd like to address would be my university age self, or at least myself in the first few years of my 20s. And I suppose the thing that I would tell them would be to reassure them that at some point I do get married and have a family. Because that was one of the things that I was very irrationally worried about, that I'd never find someone. And I did find someone. And I'd like to tell myself that when I'm younger, so I could have a bit more fun when I was single and not overlay it with so much anxiety. But I'd also tell my younger self something that I've learnt since having children, really, which is if you put that side of yourself to one side, if you're happy and confident with your home life, then the rest of yourself can really flourish. And that by not worrying so much about my social life and my love life and stuff like that, that would free me up for all sorts of wonderful things that I could have done in my university years and my teen and my 20s that I didn't do because I was spending so much time worrying about social and romantic matters. And that's, I think, what I'd like to tell my younger self. So that's my sermon on the mic.
Well, I hope he's listening. Young Keith, pay attention. Get out there and have affairs and stuff, because your family life is going to take care of itself. Just have fun. And I think that's true for everyone, isn't it? I think when I look back on my sort of younger days, I think there was part of me that was very flippant and whatever come my way was fine. But I remember having those same thoughts, thinking, not that I was never going to get married, but I kind of had a social timeline where I thought, oh, I've got to move out from home at a certain stage. Wouldn't it be terrible if I'm in my 30s and still living with my mum and dad? And wouldn't it be terrible if I got to this age? And I kind of had those kind of mental benchmarks. But in all honesty, life happens and it all takes care of itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, one thing that has surprised me about getting a bit older is that actually, as I said earlier, that there are real pleasures in being in your 40s. And that I think I had this model of life when I was in my teens and when I was in my 20s, that this had to be the best days of your life. And it can be the best days of your life. And indeed, some of them were the best days of my life. But actually, life doesn't stop after that. And actually, there are real pleasures in being middle-aged. And there'll probably be great pleasures in being old. And I think young people sometimes forget that. And it's been a very pleasant surprise for me.
I'm looking forward to being my dad's age. He's 76, and he just walks around saying what he wants. And it seems liberating, but he doesn't really care.
Well, it's like that poem, "When I'm old, I'll wear purple." You know, that when you're old, you can do what you want, or at least that's the fantasy.
Well, I think he's living the fantasy. I really do. Keith, how can people connect with you?
I am on Twitter at Keith Kahn Harris, and I have a website which is kahnharris.org, KAHN-HARRIS.org.
I will have all those links on the show notes. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and joining up the dots of your life. Please come back again when you have more dots to join up, because I believe that by joining up those dots and connecting our past is the best way to build our futures. Keith, thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck with the show.
David doesn't want you to become a faded version of the brilliant self you were once to become. So he's put together an amazing guide for you called the 8 Pieces of Advice that every successful entrepreneur practices, including the 2 that changed his life. Head over to joinupdots.com to download this amazing guide for free, and we'll see you tomorrow on Join Up Dots.